Welcome. Thanks for joining us with our second lesson of Esther, the book of Esther. Last week we talked about King Xerxes, the king of Persia. He had a queen by the name of Vashti. He had this big, huge banquet going on that had nobles, all the important people of the 127 of his provinces, and he wanted to show off the beauty of his queen Vashti. Her name means the desired one. So he sent a messenger for Vashti to come. So she refused to go. It made the king furious. Xerxes, this big 8-foot tall guy, king of the mightiest kingdom at that time in the land, he was refused and he was drunk and he didn't like it. And so I want us to begin reading here in chapter 1 of Esther, beginning verses 13 through 18. I'm going to talk about proposing foolish solutions. What do you do about this? The queen didn't come. It reads like this. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media, who had special access to the king and were the highest in the kingdom. These were the cabinet level officials. These were the closest men, but the highest ranking officials in his huge kingdom. We read the next verse, verse 15. According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of the King Xerxes that the eunuchs had taken to her. Now, I like what it says here because this is really important. It says, according to the law. History tells us that whenever a law was set in order and was stamped with approval by the king, it could never be changed. Even if the king changed his mind and said, nope, man, I made a bad decision on that one, we're going to redo that. No, it couldn't be undone. So this was a huge thing. He could not even, unable to overturn his own law. So I want to read verse 16, and we'll see later how this whole aspect is revealed later on in the book of Esther. But in verse 16, then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. Before I read any more, I just want to say, I think that this guy, Memucan, he must have been afraid of his wife finding out. And if his wife found out that the queen did not come to the beck and call of the king, then his wife and all the other wives, they're going to follow the same suit. So I think there was a lot of personal thing here. He was afraid to lose some leverage with his own wife, okay? I mean, this might have been the beginning of the women's liberation movement, the king's cabinet. Well, it didn't happen. Verse 17. For the queen's conduct will become known to all women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. To this very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discard. God forbid that a king or any man that has his wife reject anything that he's asking her to do. God forbid that ever happened, right? I mean, that would have been the day, right? Well, they'd live in, right, guys? Just kidding, it would not have been. But thank God, women, you've come a long ways. America is a great place to be, especially if you're a woman. There's still 18 countries in our world that women have to receive permission to do almost everything. They can't get a job. Their employer doesn't accept them to work unless they get a document or verbal approval from their husband. I mean, it's horrible things like that. Saudi Arabia, women still are not allowed to drive vehicles. And so it's not perfect, ladies. We've come a long ways, and we want you to be elevated more. But we have it better than most countries. With that in mind, I want us to look what happens next. And I've entitled this A Providential Divorce because that's really what's going to happen here. It's not a pretty thing. In verses 19 through 22, we're going to be looking at those. But before so, I want you to set your thoughts on just a moment what had to be going through King Xerxes' mind. Here he allowed his government council to come in and help him make this decision. What should we do to the queen because she did not come at the king's request? It says that he was basically drunk. He had been drinking heavily. He made this rash decision. What do you think he might have thought the next day or two after he had awakened and wasn't drunk and thought about the decision that he made? It was huge because this not only affected the queen's life, which would have destroyed her life forever. She would have been set somewhere in seclusion, but it ruined, what was happening to the king and to others who were close to her. We read in verse 19. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout the vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. Well, these men, as well as King Xerxes, were unreasonable, foolish, and self-centered, to not even respect the dignity of a woman and the dignity of a queen. But this was very typical of that culture and of the reign of Xerxes. We read in verse 21. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household using his native tongue. I look at that and think, wow, this is extensive. And again, life-changing for so many people. It says he sent dispatches. If you read about the Persian postal service, that's kind of what this was, there was none other like it. Greek historian Herodotus said this, nothing mortal travels so fast as these Persian messengers. So along the road, they would have a line of men on horses. At certain points through the day, it was kind of like a relay race where they would run up, the horses would run up and to that designated point, that line, and the next messenger would carry the message that the king had given, and he would carry it, and this went across all 127 provinces that were in the Persian kingdom. This was a big thing. It was a big deal. And as you read about these messengers, these postal guys, it didn't matter what the weather was, snow, rain, heat, darkness of night. They traveled. They went all through the night. They were like amazing couriers that traveled to get the king's message. That huge relay race, amazing. So news traveled extremely fast with the king's request. In closing out this chapter 1, the last phrase in verse 22 is kind of like a bright yellow highlighter screaming out the custom of that day and time and of the male chauvinism to its core. I read it a moment ago, but I want you to think. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household using his native tongue. With this type of leadership, it doesn't look too hopeful for Queen Vashti as well as for a lot of women. But let me remind you, the theme of the book of Esther is God's timing is perfect. That means that God is weaving out his plan no matter what pain we're going through in our life. Does he care? Yes, he cares. But he's weaving out his plan when there's disaster, when there's turmoil, when there's trouble, when there's pandemics, whatever's going on, we don't understand what God is doing. We think he may be silent or on vacation somewhere, which is certainly not the case. He still has perfect timing. And out of thousands of young women, we're going to see something that God did in an amazing way. In all this 127 group of provinces of Persia, what chance would one certain young woman who was a Jewish young woman have to represent the Jewish people and ultimately be one of the co-heroes to save her life? What's the chance of that? See, ultimately, she is going to do that. And I want you to consider this. God will sometimes allow bad things to happen to bring good things to happen in our lives to fulfill His purpose. Because what is impossible with man is possible with God. And if you want to join us on our next study, go ahead and read chapter 2 in the book of Esther. We'll find out what's going to happen.